thanks for joining us. This is the first session of our 4-part training, Livestock Surface Water Risk and Forage Assessments for BC Range. I'm Shauna McKinnon, the coordinator for the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network. And we're pleased to be hosting this training series presented by Andrew Pantel. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting the session today from Vancouver, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. Andrew has a packed hour, so I'm just going to say a quick thank you to the BC Ministry Agriculture of Food, Fisheries and Agriculture. They have provided funding for the development of this workshop series through the governments of Canada and British Columbia under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a federal provincial territorial initiative. For those that are not familiar with the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network, I'm just going to give the briefest of introductions to the network. ACARN was launched in 2017 to foster collaboration and build stronger connections between industry, researchers, and government to improve adaptation research and extension across BC's agriculture sector. ACARN is led by a steering committee that includes representatives from all of BC's agricultural research institutions, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the BC Agricultural Council, and the Climate and Agriculture Initiative BC. Our vision is to be a hub for sharing research-based information, expertise, and resources across BC's ag sector. And you can learn more about the network and about the projects and events that we are hosting and become a network member at bcacarn.com. So with that, I'm just going to pass things over now to Andrew. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, and thanks for signing up for the webinar. I'm hoping, I think each of the 4 webinars will run about probably around 40 minutes or so. So there should be lots of time for questions and lots of time for maybe a little bit extra discussion at the end. So my name is Andrew Pantel, and I'm here with Darren Brooks, and he's also going to be presenting along with me here. And I'm a rangeland ecologist. I worked with the provincial range program out of Prince George office and out of the Nelson office from about 2005 until 2014. And since then, I've been working as a consultant on projects related to range management, restoration ecology, boreal forest ecology, and wetland monitoring throughout BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And Darren is a GIS specialist who has worked on remote sensing projects throughout Canada, and he's done a lot of work on these projects with me. And I'll lead most of the presentations, but Darren will step in when discussing the climate models and when we look at how to access some of the mapping layers. And so our goal of this is to provide, of this webinar series, is to provide an overview of a project that we've been working on since 2016 in the Cariboo Regional District. And this project, it discusses incorporating climate change models into range management practices. And so the webinar series is kind of an overview. Well, it'll wrap up with an overview of 3 pilot projects that were implemented in the Cariboo district, where this planning process that we're going to go through was used for planning water developments and planning water development locations. So where this project came from, and I guess the start of it was the BC Agriculture and Food Climate Action Initiative partnered with agriculture producers and local and provincial governments to develop the Cariboo Regional Adaptation Strategies in 2014. And so these strategies identified the potential impacts of climate change on the agricultural sector, and then outlined a series of strategies and actions, I guess, to address these challenges. And one of the big concerns that was brought up by producers was this this acknowledgement that we need a strategy for sufficient water on Crown Range as water is critical for livestock use on Crown Range. And so there were 2 previous projects that have been done already prior to right now, and one of them was the surface water risk assessment and options, and that was kind of the original project from 2016, 2017 that developed the planning process. that led to a second project with some extension and some producer engagement, where we had a workshop and identified 3 range units in the Caribou Regional District where water is a concern, and then tried to develop a strategy with the producers to sort of mitigate some of that risk. And so right now there was this desire to move forward with some pilot projects to put some infrastructure in the ground, and so that's where we are right now. We've put some water developments into the ground on 2 of the range units, and we have a third one that is still in the planning process, but we're hoping to move forward on it. And so the final webinar will be kind of going over the construction methods and what these water developments look like and how they were planned and how we put them into place. So today, what to expect, or I guess what to expect overall with all the webinars. So today we're going to kind of go through the background, the history of the project, what the climate change models look like, what the key findings from the original report were, the current water risk assessment map set, and then webinar 2, we'll spend some more time with just the model and what are some of the assumptions and the challenges of the hydrology model and the key layers and how to access these map layers. The third webinar will be more of looking at actual range management planning. So using the map set that we have that I'll introduce at the end of this webinar, and using that map set to predict zones of use, determine carrying capacity, and identify locations for rangeland health assessments, and we'll talk a little bit about forage inventory and then planning range developments. And then the last webinar will be this overview of the water developments in the Caribou. So going from that model to right through sort of how we implemented at the range unit scale, to implement to a planning strategy, and then what it looks like when we put infrastructure in the ground for some of these water developments. So overall, there's, I guess, a few important things to note from the climate models, and the temperature over the entire landscape is going to increase, and so generally what we're going to see is more evaporation, and that on surface waters, no matter where they're located, there's going to be more evaporation off of that surface water. And so how to kind of visualize it in the Caribou context is the conditions that we're observing at the 700 to 1,000 meter elevation now will be sort of that 1,000 to will be moving upwards to 1,000 to 1,300 meter elevations by the 2050s climate scenario. And our annual precipitation is also set to increase, but the increase in evaporation will more than offset that increase in precipitation. So we're actually going to have also this increased moisture deficit and increased evaporation deficits that are associated with the climate change model. So the areas that are currently dry are going to get more dry, and then arguably some of these bunchgrass ecosystems and interior Doug fir ecosystems are going to expand on the landscape we're looking at. So I'm going to pass it over to Darren for the next half a dozen slides, and yeah, he's going to go through kind of where the climate model came from. So Darren, can I pass it along?
Yeah, go ahead. So just, there you go, perfect, thanks. Okay, so I'll just really briefly go through the climate model, not a climate model that we developed, but the climate model that we're using to develop the model that Andrew was talking about. So in 2020, Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations, Rural Development, they provided us a document for model and scenario guidance for climate modeling. And they essentially summed it up into three large points. And the first point is the report recommended to use an ensemble model or multiple models strategy to ensure that uncertainties associated with large geographic areas are addressed. I'll just flip this slide there, Andrew. So the premise behind an ensemble model is simply that not all models work equally well for all geographic locations. So because when you're dealing with a very large area, sometimes you need more than one model to describe that geographic area. So an ensemble model really sort of serves two purposes. First, the more models that are used and agree with each other, the higher certainty or the higher confidence you have in that model. And secondly, an average of multiple good models is always better than a single great model. So ensembles are generally using statistics to reduce uncertainty and to develop a better average model. I'm going to flick the next slide. The second high-level point is a little bit trickier, something called the RCP, or the representative concentration pathway. So what the RCP is, it's a way to measure the greenhouse gas trajectory that's used to describe different climate futures. And it's all based on the predicted volume of greenhouse gases in the years to come. So although Forest Lands and Natural Resources proposes to use an RCP of 4.5, or at least that's what it says in the document, that assumes that CO2, CH4, SO2, all of those things will start declining by about 2045 or 2050. However, if you want to flip the slide, Andrew, there is scientific support now to actually use what's called RCP 8.5. And that's a model based on minimal changes to greenhouse gases and an overprojection of effects of coal. So essentially what RCP 8.5 assumes is that we do absolutely nothing to mitigate climate change. So it's essentially considered a worst case scenario. And although it initially was considered a worst case scenario, it still remains to be a useful baseline due to the unpredictability to political policies and people's contribution to greenhouse gases. So it's not uncommon, even though RCP 4.5 is suggested as a happy medium, that the worst case scenario is used often as a baseline. Next slide, Andrew. And then finally, the last higher level slide is the interpreting near future projections. So we're talking about not only modeling climate today, but modeling climate in the future, what we call the near future. So the document from Forest Lands and Natural Resources indicated that using CLIMATEBC's near future projections for the mid-2020s, the mid-2050s, and the mid-2080s fits within their best practices model. Next slide. So we've been using CLIMATEBC that's developed at UBC, and we've met both with Dr. Tong Li Wong and Dr. Dave Spittlehouse to derive our current and near future climate data. So we've been in good hands for sure when it comes to the climate stuff. Next slide, Andrew. So the climate data that we're using for this model meets all of those criteria that was outlined in the document in 2020. So we use a 15 GCM ensemble model, or global circulation model. So I think that the document suggested 7 to 8 ensemble model. We use a 15 ensemble model. The future data that we're deriving can be derived using the 4.5 or the 8.5 RCP. We have the ability to do both, so we can create both maps or both layers. And finally, our near future data timeline is actually using that mid to 2050s or the 2055 data. Next slide. So CLIMATEBC, when you run your data through it, can report hundreds and hundreds of climate related outputs, either at an annual or a seasonal or a monthly scale. And although it's tempting to use a lot of these derived variables because there are lots of really great information in there, the balance to find parsimony or the least number of strongest variables for your model often wins the day. So there are a couple that we've sort of cherry picked out of the outputs: temperature, precipitation, particularly precipitation that enters the hydrological system through snow, moisture deficits. They can all provide really important clues. But there was one variable that we've picked out that was most important. Next slide, Andrew, and that's the Hargreaves reference evaporation. And that plays an important part in the simplified models that Andrew's going to now present. So I'll turn it back to you there, Andrew.
Thanks, Darren.
Yeah.
So in summary, I guess, and the key findings from the report from the climate models are that the drier regions, so including that Doug fir, interior Doug fir zone, are most at risk. And then also, what can we accomplish with this knowledge gained from the modeling process? So we have this large regional scale model, but what can we accomplish with the model when we're looking at management tools? And then that leads to this incorporating the climate projections into range management. So how do we use these climate projections at a scale that is suitable for range management? And so that was kind of like the big challenge at the start, is this linking the regional, the district, or the regional scale model to a range unit level, and then making that from and you know, creating this tool that's useful for planning smaller water developments, or water developments that are useful for a producer, or useful at that range unit scale, and even smaller, like a portion of the range unit scale. So another key finding is the application into range management, and identifying these areas, that are this water resources that are at risk, but then making a connection to where the forage resource is at risk is also important. And so part of the goal is to identify the at-risk water, and determine where the forage is in relation to that water. And this is what we'll get into in webinar 3. And we'll also kind of, I guess, vice versa, not just identifying the water, but then also identifying the forages, and then trying to potentially create a management situation, or water planning situation that can kind of capture some of that, maybe some of that forage resource that we might not be able to capture with the current water resources. When we know, so I guess another key finding is the importance of the forage inventory. And so we know that when we have detailed knowledge of this forage resource, that we can create a detailed map that can map the forage on the landscape. And this can assist with forage calculations. It can assist with just a visual representation of where our forage base is. And we have information from the vegetation resource inventory through forestry that is quite detailed, and really you know, chops up the landscape into a lot of smaller polygons, but it's almost overly confusing for a range intervention sense. And so to amalgamate some of those polygons that forestry uses within the VRI is a goal of the range vegetation inventory, and to create more of a simplified range map. So going from a kind of a detailed, overly detailed, well, what I am calling really detailed inventory map on the left, to something that's less detailed and visual on the right. And so creating these forage inventory maps is another key aspect of moving forward here. Smaller ponds and shallower ponds are at the greatest risk to climate change, and in particular these perched ponds that are less than 5 hectares in size were identified as being most at risk to drying down, and to a point where they're either inaccessible to livestock, so we create these muddy edges, or these as the pond is shrinking down, we're creating more difficulty for livestock to be able to access that water, and then also there's a potential of reduced water quality. So these are the ponds that are more susceptible to evaporation, and keep in mind some of these key terms, the perched versus a connected pond, because they're quite different hydrologically, and we are trying to treat them differently within the climate, within the model, in terms of identifying what's resilient and what's not. There's different strategies. So the report also identified that there's different strategies that should be required for developing water in these perched ponds versus developing water that's connected to a groundwater source, and recognizing that hydrology is important when discussing resiliency for future climate scenarios, and these different strategies. You know, I guess think of some strategies in the past have been to you know, we can create a resilient water body by maybe scooping it out, or creating a deeper water source to store more water where an existing water source is. And that strategy to increase water storage in a closed basin pond can actually be detrimental in a sense, because oftentimes some of these closed basin ponds, they also have a clay pan at the bottom of them that's actually what's holding the water on the landscape, in that landscape position. And when they get excavated, what ends up happening is you punch a hole through that clay pan, and it ends up leading that you get less water storage, because the water can potentially drain out. And so while that may be, and that's a strategy that's been used for water developments in the past, that has potential in connected systems, because they're getting an influence of water as opposed to an effluence of water. And yeah, so just recognizing that we have these different, this connected versus perch ponds on the landscape is important for water development planning. the other key finding, and I think it's important to highlight this, is that we're not just looking at future climate. We're not just planning to 2055 or 2050. This strategy and this information can also be used for drought management plans. And so it's real time, I guess, in a sense, in that if we know we're going to have, or if we're preparing for a drought year, or this tool and the map sets and identifying the risk of the ponds. These are the ponds that are at risk in drought years, and so they're at risk in future climate scenarios, but then they're also at risk in drought or useful for drought management planning. And I think that's an important highlight that makes all producers understand the importance of planning for drought as well, and so important at that point. Another key finding was to consider grazing schedules, perhaps not just consider water developments, but consider grazing schedules, and perhaps pastures that are identified as having large areas of at-risk water are best suited for early season grazing, and then perhaps pastures with ponds that are connected to the groundwater or at higher elevations are more suitable for later season grazing. So more of a we're not just looking at this as an infrastructure problem, but maybe also a planning tool as well for planning seasons of use and when best to be grazing certain areas. So we've spent a lot of time on focusing on the quantity of water and how to assess the risk based on quantity, but water quality is also at risk, and this is something it's acknowledged, and we need to put a lot more thought into it, I think, in terms of what exactly are the water quality risks with climate change scenarios, and are we going to see these increases in concentration of salts and bacteria, and how is that going to affect animal health and livestock health in certain areas. Again, there's been research done on this, but we haven't incorporated that water quality aspect into our planning. But different landscapes and different ponds are more at risk to this increasing concentration of bacteria. And what we've seen in Saskatchewan is areas that hadn't experienced drought in about 10 years, and maybe folks getting a bit complacent in terms of where livestock were using water and not recognizing soon enough that we're in a drought year, and then all of a sudden animals are put into a pasture where there's water quality issues that show up when the ponds evaporate, dry down, concentrations of sulfates and salts increase, and led to a massive die-off of animals in the community pasture within a matter of about 3 days of them not being checked, and 200 animals have died. And so there's large, wide-scale problems that could occur if all of a sudden we are getting into a situation where the water quality is being reduced in future climate situations. And so I guess this is just being aware of that potential problem. So so now using this, so we have all this information, and what do we do with it? How do we move forward, and what are we using it to predict? And the goal is to kind of go back to the main concern that producers brought forward in the planning sessions, which is how do the climate scenarios impact the water resources on Crown land, and how can we address those? And so looking at our focus is on a 2050s climate context. Our focus is on looking at our forage resources. We can now sort of identify those forage resources on the landscape. We can look at what are the water demands and water use by livestock in comparison to what's being drawn through evaporation, and identifying locations that are most suitable for range infrastructure. And I put it kind of open as range infrastructure because I do feel like this, mostly what we're dealing with in this, what we're going to deal with in this webinar series are mostly water developments, but there's other range infrastructure, whether, you know, fencing or trails or whatnot, that this planning process can also be used to assist with. And so I guess also just keeping that in the back of our minds when we're looking at the mapping process, that by predicting kind of where our reliable water is, where our reliable forage is, and where our predicted zones of use are, we can assist with planning range infrastructure now and based on future climate scenarios. So what's next with the next steps with the original report from 2017 is to take these concepts that we learned in the Caribou project and apply them over the provincial range, Crown Range Basin. And so that's what we're in the process of working with right now with the BC Cattlemen's Association and Ministry of Agriculture and various number of other partners. And this sort of but the original project was kind of brought was through the Caribou, and then now we're applying these concepts over the province. So the map set that we're introducing here, you know, it will be. I don't have timelines, but hopefully they'll be available soon to you know, resource users over the province. So we have 8 maps that generally complete this water set, or this surface water risk assessment set. As Darren mentioned, I just call it reference evaporation, and it's that Hargreaves reference evaporation. So we can compare the 2020 climate or the current climate with our 2050 scenario. We have maps that show what the projected BEC shift or the ecosystem shift is on the landscape. General range management maps assist with range management, whether it's some slope maps with slope information on it. So that's going to help us assist where livestock are moving on the landscape. Slope influences movement. We have the forage category maps, and we have a flow accumulation map and a disturbance history map. And so I'll just highlight these a bit now. We'll kind of go through each one of them very, very briefly. We're going to spend more time on how to go about using them in webinar 3 and how they're used for the planning process. But I'll sort of shine some light on them or highlight them now. So the predicted zones of use are based on distance to water. So general, I guess, general science of range management says that livestock will generally move about 1.5 kilometers from water for foraging, and that is on a more of a complex landscape or in a hilly landscape, whereas they'll move up to 3 kilometers in a landscape with low slope. And so we can buffer those water resources that we have on the maps and create these predicted zones of use that show where livestock are predicted to be based on distance to water. And then when we have the slope on top of that as well, that also assists with identifying these potential zones of use. When we look at the map on the left, that's with all lakes greater than 2 hectares. So those would be our lakes that are, or ponds that are smaller, but greater than 2 hectares. And then also on the right, then we have lakes that are greater than, or ponds that are greater than 5 hectares. And so the greater than 5 hectares are those that are large enough to, we've considered them to be resilient in climate change scenarios, whereas lakes at 2 to 5 hectares are considered at risk in climate change scenarios and in drought scenarios, and those lakes less than 2 hectares are probably at risk in just our general year, our average year. And that this is very this can vary depending on, obviously depending on whereabouts you are in the province, but within the IDF and within the drier ecosystems, so within the interior Douglas fir ecosystems or in the dry ecosystems of BC, this is generally a pretty good rule of thumb. And we'll get more into this in webinar 2 in terms of how the what the equation is and what it looks like for identifying those zones of identifying those ponds that are at risk or high resilient versus low resilience. So we'll spend more time on that in the reference evaporation maps. So they show a similar layer of that buffer overlay, but then they also bring it into where our evaporation, our higher zones of evaporation are within a range unit. And this can be useful in looking at which, if we have a whole bunch of at-risk water on a landscape, it'll assist with saying which is most at risk. And so we have the evaporation maps that are also part of the map set. And you can use all of this information can be used to from an individual pond. Each one of these ponds has an identifier, and each one of the ponds we have the water. We can calculate the water budget on it based off of what's happened with evaporation and precipitation inputs. Obviously, when they're connected ponds, we're going to have more challenges with that, and we'll also get into that further on here in later webinars. Our forage category maps are important for identifying where the primary range is and where the forage types are on the range unit. And what we end up having is what we want to create is we want to create a map that we have it all filled in. And so if you look at the map on the left, where we just take the information coming right out of the model, we have a lot of white space on it, and we have a lot of blank locations where we don't know what the forage resource is, or we don't have very reliable information to tell us what the forage is in that area of the land base. And so as we get more detailed field information, so as we go clip and sample and get just a more detailed forage resource information, we can create a more filled in map. And that is our overall goal, is to get rid of that white space and have more ability to predict what the forage is on the landscape based on the range vegetation layers and based on amalgamating some of that vegetation resource inventory layers that forestry uses. And so we're working on that on the provincial scale right now with range branch. The predicted shift in BEC is, it can assist with identifying where the future forage is on the landscape. So what the future forage supply could be, as well as linking the current forage supply to the range unit. So identifying where the BEC zones are on the range unit can be useful for the forage inventory. Realistically, are we going to see these big shifts in plant communities in the next 30 years? And probably, I mean, I would say not likely. We're not likely going to see huge shift in species compositions. However, when we include the disturbance layer, so the bottom right map represents area that was impacted by the fires in 2016 in the group, and that's on that specific range unit. So you can say a significant portion of that range unit was disturbed with fire. And so in the presence of this disturbance, it's more likely that plant community is going to move towards a trajectory of what's predicted in the future versus what it was. And so that's kind of how we can conceptually use the BEC shifts. It can also assist with the sampling plan and determining if you know which ecotypes or biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification types that you're looking at, or that you want to sample for forage. It'll help just kind of visualize where in the landscape those are, and then having those buffers and the zones of use and the resiliency identified within those maps also assists with where the predicted zones of use are in comparison to where the BEC zones are. And also, when we consider these Beck shifts on the landscape, we can take from it that, you know, we get kind of a representation of how much shift are we getting in the different zones and variants. And for example, maybe we want to look at some of the ecotypes that are often associated with grazing, like the IDF and the bunchgrass systems and the ponderosa pine systems. And so this information can be useful in determining where you know, we can have this information by percentage at the district scale as well as at the range unit scale, and so it's a good sort of, I guess, representation of where the shift is going. If we're looking at, you know, right now in 100 Mile House, the IDF MW2 represents about 1.2% of the landscape. Well, when we look at the 2050 scenario, it's representing almost 20% of the landscape, and none of the landscape is represented by the ponderosa pine ecosystems in the current scenario, but in the future climate scenario, we have about 3% of the landscape. And so I didn't put all the biogeoclimatic classification systems for each district on here. I just highlighted some of the ones that are of interest for most of the interest for grazing, I feel. So anyway, we can look at those maps as a visual, or we can actually get right down and look at what the potential shifts in percentage are over the future climate scenarios. And sort of, I guess, the last, but definitely not the least most important map is our flow accumulation map. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time on the details of how this is put together in webinar 2, but generally the goal or the intention of this is to help us with identifying separating this closed basin versus connected ponds on the landscape, and helping with you know, possibly locate where the best locations for water development are based on, and it's just an overall, I guess, representation of what the hydrology looks like on the landscape. It's a little bit different from what we can get with our current layers of trim, and for those of you that are familiar with the water layers on the landscape, the trim layers. The flow accumulation is a little bit different, and we have this. So now we have this information for the range units as well, and we'll get into that a little bit in webinar 2. So what to expect from webinar 2 to 4 is we're going to look at how to identify these water bodies that are at risk. So we'll go through the calculations. Go through the kind of like the water balance of a closed basin and open basin ponds. We'll review, probably not spend much more time on reviewing the climate scenarios. And then in webinar 3, we're going to look at the specific maps and how to use those mapping layers and the GIS layers to calculate carrying capacity, to calculate water use, and to identify where potentially the best locations for water developments are, and also look at using the maps for planning sampling and for planning rangeland health assessments. And then that last, like I mentioned earlier, that last webinar is going to be an overview of the 3 projects that are going on in the Caribou. And you know, I see for the first time in my life, I might be finishing a presentation early, and but I think that's great. I don't want to, you know, I want to leave lots of opportunity for some questions, and also, you know, I think I sort of have the webinars planned out to run around that 40-minute range, and so yeah, I don't want to rush anything, and people always like leaving early, so. I'm gonna leave it at that for now, and if you have any questions now, that's great. I plan on leaving, you know, sort of 3 to 5 minutes at the beginning of the next webinar as well to ask questions. So if there's something that comes up or that you think of between now and Thursday, then we can also address some of that on Thursday morning.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. We do have a first question for you here in the chat. Do water quality issues address water-related issues such as foot rot or the susceptibility to water hemlock poisoning?
I think the water quality issue is completely up in the air, and we should explore that for definitely. I would like to see, what I'd like to see is that we kind of get put something together where we can identify what all the water quality issues are. And so we know that bacteria and salts can affect for the drinking water, but for the actual the physical foot rot and stuff like that, I think that's a great question, and I think we would see that as being an issue because as these ponds dry down in the water and we get these mucky edges and more difficult access to the edge of ponds, that we should definitely be acknowledging that as an issue, and we do acknowledge, I guess, the overall shrinkage of the pond, and so if that's a known cause of foot rot or some other animal health issue, then this in a sense does, because what we get from each pond, we can calculate what the total loss of water is on that pond on the landscape, and so that information is now available because each pond has a unique identifier, and each pond will have a unique spreadsheet that shows what the loss of volume in area is. And so and we'll get into that in webinar 2 or 3. I think we go through that spreadsheet.
Thanks, Andrew. And there's another question here for you about what are helpful strategies to address water issues in livestock grazing in future climate scenarios? Addressing
evaporation for surface water would be the key. And so creating either water storage or identifying water sources that are being fed by groundwater and developing those, as opposed to putting money and effort into developing perched ponds. That's a fantastic question, and that's kind of how the projects in the Caribou were. That type of thing was thought out for those projects, and stay tuned for webinar 4. I won't spoil it, but yeah, that's generally just trying to address the evaporation.
Is the model looking at the loss of alpine areas to forests?
It can, with if we review because it'll show it'll show what the potential Beck shift is, and the information's there. It's not like looking at it directly, but the information is there for folks to ask those questions. And I also think part of getting this out and showing everyone kind of what we're doing is to gather these questions so that we can start exploring some of those questions and exploring what's important to producers, what's important to range managers in terms of these shifts and things that they see on the landscape or they perceive on the landscape as being important, that we should be exploring them. Because right now, we're asking some good questions right now, but getting this out there is part of it, is trying to generate more questions and more things that we can ask.
So here's another question for you. Does the forage inventory account for varying productivity to annual weather conditions or account for forage quality?
It doesn't account for, that is a huge challenge to account for annual variation in productivity on a complex landscape like we have in BC. In less complex landscapes and where we have more uniform forage, that's quite common to do that. And also, but it's very difficult, and we just don't have enough samples right now. So this summer we're doing there's going to be a huge sampling program that just trying to get more and more samples and then try to capture some of that annual variation in forage, and then perhaps trying to resample some areas that have been sampled in the past under different with different weather conditions for that year. So it's important to have numerous samples over numerous years to capture that, and that this planning process can be used to do that, and it can be used to assist with locating your sampling positions, but and sampling your weather stations and things like that is an ideal, or sampling your range reference areas is an ideal way of sort of trying to accomplish some of that. And then in terms of forage quality, we do have some forage quality information that was done in 2015 with the BC Cattlemen's Association. And so some of that work is being done and can be included in the model when we can incorporate this plant species composition to some of that forage quality stuff. So that is being looked at for sure.
Well, we do still have some time, so if anyone else wants to ask questions now, please go ahead. Also, a lot more will be answered in the future webinars. Andrew will be going to everything into much more detail. Okay, well, I think we could wrap up, Andrew, if you'd like.
Sounds good. Looking forward to seeing everyone on Thursday morning, hearing everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you on Thursday. Thank you, Andrew and Darren, for joining us this morning.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.